Remember, your spine is not designed to handle loaded, flexed, or extended positions. The musculature surrounding your spine is designed to create stiffness so that you can effectively transmit energy from your hips and shoulders. Okay, I'm going to pause the quote. This is why back pain and back injuries are so common. Your hips and your shoulders are designed to take the load. So, if you are having back pain and back issues, one, we should work on mobilizing your spine because if your spine can't move through a full range of motion, then that can cause issues. But also, if you don't have enough support from your ab and your back muscles to create that stiffness, then that's going to cause issues. But if your hips and your shoulders are not strong, mobile, and stable enough to be able to push the load, then you're going to have back pain. Welcome to Elevate Your Ride, the podcast dedicated to elevating your performance in the saddle. I'm Ellie, your personal trainer.
And I'm Lauren, your mindset coach.
All right. Thank you for coming back for another episode of Elevate Your Ride. Thank you for following along in this Becoming a Supple Leopard series that really shows me that you are dedicated to learning more about your body and improving your fitness. So if you're still here following along in this series, I am proud of you. So last time we kind of talked a lot about shoulders and hips and posture and breathing and a lot about functional fitness and why it's really important to master the basics and to basically be strong to avoid injury. And in this chapter, we're going to build upon that. Let's go ahead and get started with the idea of what's called a one joint rule. And Dr. Kelly Starrett defines the one joint rule as the premise of the one joint rule is simple. When you are working from a braced, neutral position, flexion and extension should only occur in your hips and shoulders, not in your spine. Your hips and shoulders are designed to support and accommodate large loads and dynamic movements, and movement should always be initiated from those primary engines. Get a pause that quote. So, when we're talking about a braced neutral position, again, that's something that we went over pretty in depth in that last episode. So we're going to start by screwing our feet into the ground, squeezing our butt to keep our pelvis in a neutral position, generating some torque through our hips to open up our hip angle, to lift the arches up off the ground, to stabilize the hips. And then we've got a neutral pelvis. So the ab and the glute muscles are working together to keep that pelvis tucked up underneath our spine so our lower back does not arch. And then we're taking a deep breath in through the nose and breathing out through the diaphragm to balance our rib cage over our pelvis. So as you're breathing out, you're pulling your rib cage down and you're engaging your abdominal muscles as you exhale. So breathing in through the nose, through the diaphragm. And then as you breathe out, think about pulling your rib cage down and engaging your abdominal muscles. And then we're going to pull our head and neck back into a neutral position. We're going to externally rotate our shoulders into a neutral position. So those are all the steps for the bracing sequence, getting ourselves in a braced neutral position. So our ears should be right over our shoulders. Our rib cage should be flat, not extended, not flexed. Our pelvis and our hips should be stacked right underneath our shoulders. Our knees and our ankles should be right underneath our hips, and we are ready for movement when we are in this position. And the tricky part is maintaining this position as you go to do whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's you're walking, you're picking up a heavy saddle, you're carrying heavy water buckets, you're doing dishes, it doesn't matter what it is. If you are moving your body and putting it under load, meaning that you are challenging it with some sort of resistance, if you want to live life as pain-free as possible, you need to start all your movements with this bracing sequence and be set up for success. So then when he's talking about flexion and extension, so let's talk about flexion and extension of the hips, the spine, and the shoulders. So let's start in that neutral position, okay? If I was going to flex my hips, that would basically mean that I am bringing my knee up closer to my hip, okay? So that is hip flexion. That is using my hip flexor muscles, which are in the front of my body, connecting my leg to my torso. So when you're riding, you're using your hip flexors to lift your legs up and lift your horse's belly up to you. And then hip extension would be the opposite. It would be extending your hips. So when you walk, if you step your right foot forward, if you are doing hip flexion, your hip flexor is pulling that leg forward. And then your glute is going to push you into hip extension, which is going to push the hips forward, pulling the leg back behind you. So when we're riding, it's weird because we're both in hip flexion and hip extension at the same time. We're using our glutes to pull our legs back behind us. And then we're also doing hip flexion. Our hip flexors are lifting our legs up, lifting the horse's belly up to us. So we're in both hip flexion and hip extension at the same time, which is why it's so important to strengthen both, not just one. And then let's talk about the shoulders next. So, shoulder flexion would be same thing. My arm is going to raise up over my head. Okay. So, my shoulder muscle is flexing to pull up my arm. So, if I'm riding, if I'm going to use shoulder flexion to lift my hand and get connected to my horse's mouth, I'm going to use shoulder flexion to push my saddle up onto my horse's back. And then shoulder extension would be the opposite. It would be pulling my arms down by my side. One way that we use shoulder extension is when we're pulling our saddle off of our horse or we're pulling a heavy box off of the top shelf. Those sorts of movements where we're pulling something down. So, again, also very functional. So, we should be using our hips and our shoulders as much as possible. We want to have a full range of motion through the hips and the shoulders to avoid any spinal faults. So, meaning that we don't want our back flexing and extending as much as possible. We want a brace neutral spine to protect our back. Spinal extension would be arching my back, and then spinal flexion would be rounding my back. It's important to have that mobility in your daily life. That's something that you should aim for because when you're riding, you are going through spinal flexion and extension. When you're walking, you're going through it. When you're jogging next to your horse for the showmanship, when you're throwing your saddle up onto your horse, like it's something that your spine needs to be able to do. So you do need that mobility and that strength to be able to do it. But let's say that I was going to go pick up heavy water buckets up off the ground. If I let my spine flex or extend, that's putting my spine in an unbraced, unneutral position, which leads to injury. So we want our shoulders and our hips to be what's generating the torque, generating the movement, and then we want our spine to be as relatively neutral as possible. All right, I'm going to go back to a quote from the book. I define a functional movement as one that requires you to prioritize spinal mechanics and initiate movement from your hips and shoulders. When you squat, for example, you brace your spine first and then initiate the movement by sitting your hips back slightly and flexing your knees and ankles. For an exercise movement that you perform in the gym to be considered functional, it should be transferable, meaning that it is applicable to real world activities and caters to your individual goals as an athlete. Take the squat as an example. Learning how to squat teaches you how to stabilize your hips in a good position and provides a blueprint for sitting down and getting up out of a chair. It also builds strength and power, critical attributes that all athletes must acquire. I'm going to pause that quote for a minute. Functional fitness is what you should be focusing on as an equestrian athlete. Okay. If you want to get better at keeping your legs back and lifting your horse's back up, then you should be working on hip flexion and hip extension in the gym. You don't necessarily need to sit on a yoga ball and mimic riding a horse. Like we need to use traditional gym movements to improve hip flexion and hip extension. So if you need to improve hip flexion, you're going to work on your hip flexor muscles. So you're going to do exercises that involve raising your leg up. If you need to work on your hip extension, you need to work on your glute muscles. So you need to be doing hip thrusts, glute bridges, RDLs, things like that. So basically, if you're struggling with something in the saddle, you just need to figure out, okay, am I missing flexion? Am I missing extension? Am I missing mobility? Like, what is the movement that I'm actually missing? And then create it and then work on that in the gym. And that's how you're going to get better at it. If you're having pain when you're riding, let's say that when you go to drive your legs back behind you and get into that hip extension, it hurts your knees. Well, I bet you that you have weak glutes, and that I bet when you go to do things like glute bridges or squats, things like that, that are using the glutes to power you up out of the movement, I bet you're going to have that knee pain there as well. So if you don't want to have it in saddle, you should fix that in the gym. And you do that by figuring out what is causing the pain. It's probably a movement fault. You maybe have a muscle imbalance or your body is just not doing the movement as correct as possible. You need to start with the bracing sequence. You need to focus on isolating the muscles that you're supposed to be using. This is where having an experienced coach can really come in hand because this is technical. You might not understand everything that I'm saying or how to do it. That's fine. That's what you pay coaches for. They help you understand what it is and figure and diagnose what your issue is, and they give you a plan to correct it. Hi, everyone. It's your personal trainer, Ellie. If you're looking to become a stronger, more balanced, and flexible rider, I'm here to help. I offer virtual personal training sessions and customized workout plans that you can complete on your own. As a fellow competitor, I understand the physical demands riding requires, and my goal is to help you perform your best for your horse, whether you're preparing for a show or just want to improve your everyday rides. Visit lopindowntherailfitness.com or click on my website tab in the notes of this podcast episode to learn more. Let's work together to elevate your ride.
Are you looking for that extra competitive edge, struggling with show pin anxiety, or looking to set and achieve meaningful goals with your horse? Schedule a session with me, Lauren, your dedicated mindset coach. As an experienced competitor, I understand the mental demands required to excel at the highest level, and am here to support you in building a plan to help you stay accountable and reaching those goals. For more information, check out laurencervelli.com or click on the website link in our show notes. Let's work together to elevate your ride.
So then the book goes into a couple different basic movement tests that you can use to self-diagnose if you're having any issues. So you should be able to do what's called a hip hinge. So driving your hips back behind you, maintaining a flat, braced, neutral spine. And you should be able to get your fingers at least halfway down the front of your shin, ideally closer to your toes, without any movement faults happening, without your back rounding or arching or your knees bending or your head and neck falling forward, right? Like those would all be movement faults. You should be able to go into a hip hinge. So driving your hips back behind you and bending over, and then stand up out of your hip hinge and end up the same way that you started. And if you can't do that, then you got to figure out, where are you lacking? Are you lacking flexibility in your hamstrings, mobility in your spine? Is your neck tight? Like, what is causing that fault? And then you should also be able to stretch your arms up over your head without arching your back, without your head and neck pushing forward, without your knees extending. These are basic things that if you cannot do, then that's step one. That's where you need to focus on in order to be able to do anything without pain and as efficiently as possible. All right, back to a quote from the book. Most people don't even know that flexing and extending the spine is potentially harmful. People spend their entire life using their spine as a hinge, rounding their back every time they need to bend over, or tilting their rib cage back anytime they raise their arms above chest level. While these spinal faults may seem relatively harmless, they add up over time and become movement patterns. This is why so many people struggle to keep their back flat when simple movements are introduced. Initiating movement from their back has been hardwired into their motor program. This problem becomes even bigger when formal training exercises are added, because those exercises require you to maintain spinal stiffness through full range of motion. In other words, you need to be able to lower into the bottom of a squat, push a barbell overhead, and set up for a deadlift without defaulting into a flexed or extended spinal position. Remember, your spine is not designed to handle loaded, flexed, or extended positions. The musculature surrounding your spine is designed to create stiffness so that you can effectively transmit energy from your hips and shoulders. Okay, I'm going to pause the quote. This is why back pain and back injuries are so common. Your hips and your shoulders are designed to take the load. So if you are having back pain and back issues, one, we should work on mobilizing your spine, because if your spine can't move through a full range of motion, then that can cause issues. But also, if you don't have enough support from your ab and your back muscles to create that stiffness, then that's going to cause issues. But if your hips and your shoulders are not strong, mobile, and stable enough to be able to push the load, then you're going to have back pain. Mind blown, right? So If you have back pain and you go to the doctor's going to treat the symptom because the doctor does not understand this principle. They are taught to treat the pain management. So you go to the doctor, you take your pills, and maybe you feel better. But then 20 years later, they're like, oh my gosh, now you need surgery because you injured your back so severely by doing movement fault patterns over and over and over and over again. So if you want to live more pain free, you just got to figure out how to do some more functional fitness. That's all you got to do. It's easy, I promise. All right. So let's go back to the book. The process for creating a stable shoulder position is the same as the process for creating a stable hip position. That is, the hips and shoulders abide by the same laws of torque. This is because they function in much the same way. Both are ball and socket joints. They have a ton of rotational capacity and are designed to handle freakish amounts of flexion and extension load. In fact, as you start applying the principles of midline stabilization and torque to your hips and shoulders, in this chapter, you're going to learn how to create tension and organize your hips and shoulders in a good position to avoid movement errors. But first, it's important to understand that for the majority of movements, specifically formal training movements, you want to load the primary engines of your hips and shoulders first, because the tissues and joints that get loaded first during movement get loaded maximally during movement. In other words, the joint you move first will carry the lion's share of the load, which is your body weight plus any weight that you're lifting as you execute the movement. I'm going to pause that quote. So, one something that I see that's very common is people will complain about knee pain during squat. And truthfully, I probably don't even need to watch somebody squat to know why they're having the knee pain. I can probably guess that based off of this principle. So if somebody's having knee pain when they're squatting, there's likely a couple things that are going on. Either they're just full on missing the range of motion and the stability and the strength that they need in their hips and they can't maximally load their hips. So then that brunt of the load has to go somewhere and it just goes either into the knee joint or into the spine. And usually it goes into the knees until you add in load. So until you put a barbell on your back or you hold a heavy dumbbell, usually the brunt will go just straight into the front of the kneecap. So I need to watch somebody squat to determine what exactly is their issue. Is it a lack of mobility? Is it a lack of strength? Is it a lack of stability? Is it a lack of understanding? Maybe their body can actually do it. They just don't know what to ask for because they're inexperienced. That happens too. So I'm going to teach somebody who is struggling with knee pain in a squat to make sure that they are hip hinging first, not knee bending first. So a true squat means that you are bending your ankles, your knees, and your hips together at the same time at the same rate. But a lot of people start with a knee bend and then they let their hips bend. And then that causes pressure on the knee. So you have to think, yes, I want your knees and your hips moving together at the same time at the same rate. But a lot of people I'll tell to think about pushing their hips back first. And it's not a lot, it's like an inch. It's just barely the first start of the movement. And then they can start the knee bend. And what that does is that maximally loads your hips. Okay. So you're using hip flexion to push the hips back. So I'm loading my abs and my hip flexors in the first part of the movement. And then that sets my glutes up for success to be able to drive my hips forward into hip extension. If I want proper hip extension, I also need proper hip flexion. I need both. I can't just have one because not having proper hip flexion, the first part of the movement, is why all that pressure is just going into your knee joint. So I need to make sure that, yes, the glutes are strong, but that the hip flexors and the abs are also strong. My hip flexors, those need to be doing their job. So that's something that I focus on a lot to avoid having pain in my back is when I do a squat, I don't think about bending my knees and my hips. I think about my hip flexors and my abs pushing my hips back into hip flexion, and then my glutes pushing me into hip extension. Like, I don't think about what my joints are doing. I think about the muscles pushing my joints to where they need to go. And I have a lot less pain I never, ever have joint pain ever from lifting weights. Now, do I lift super heavy all the time? No, but that's partially on purpose I'm making sure that my functional fitness, my form is my first and foremost priority when I'm lifting weights, and that's how I lift weights without pain. And truthfully, I very even rarely get muscle sore from lifting weights. Now, granted, I'm very experienced. I've been lifting weights for 10 years. So I know my body and I know where to push and where not to push, but I rarely get sore. And that's because I know how to get the most out of my body without taxing it too much. And that just takes time and it just takes dedication to the right program. And you can get there too. I promise. I promise. Like, for example, if I round my back and pick up as something as light as a pillow, it will hurt. That's how much back pain I have in my daily life. So the fact that I can pick up 65-pound barbell with a braced neutral spine and making sure that my hips and my shoulders are loaded to help take the brunt of that weight, and I have no pain during or after, but yet it hurts if I bend over and pick up a pillow wrong, that shows you that it's how I'm doing it, not the load that's doing it. Hey, Elevate Your Ride fans. I wanted to take a moment to thank our very first gold sponsor, Hobby Horse Clothing Company. If you're looking for a cost effective way to elevate your look at the horse show, check out what Hobby Horse has to offer. From budget friendly crystal jackets to simple show shirts to stylish lifestyle tops, Hobby Horse has everything you need to look your best. Make sure you use code EYR2025 for an additional 10% off at checkout. Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to Elevate Your Ride. We're so excited to continue helping you elevate your performance in the saddle. To keep bringing you quality content and information, we're asking you to help us. Tell your friends about us on our podcast, like and share a meaningful quote you saw on our social media, write us a review on Spotify or Facebook. You can also join our Facebook group and ask all your health and fitness questions, or maybe post a success story to motivate another amateur. Your engagement really helps us support and encourage the equestrian community. We're also inviting sponsors and supporters to help us build our show. As a sponsor, starting at just $150, you'll receive marketing on our podcast, website, and growing social media platforms for your business. It's the perfect way to connect with the equestrian community and showcase your brand to our dedicated listeners. And for our supporters, your $50 contribution gets you a shout out on our social media and website. Every bit of support really helps fuel the show and helps us inspire and motivate equestrians. So, if you're interested in learning more about that, you can scroll down to the show notes of this episode and look for the Become a Supporter or Become a Sponsor links and click on those to get some more information. Thank you for listening. We can't wait to continue expanding our platform and helping you elevate your ride.
Hey, Elevate Your Ride fans. Are you loving our show and looking for a way to show your support? Check out our line of Elevate Your Ride merchandise. From stylish t shirts to cozy hoodies to journals and hats, we have everything you need to represent your favorite podcast. Ready to gear up? Click on the Buy Our Merchandise Here link in the podcast notes, or head on over to our website, elevateyourride.co, and click on the Store tab. Thank you for your support. Make sure to like, follow, and share our platform with your friends.
We're going to move on to talking about the laws of torque. So, quote from the book: in order to create safe and stable positions for your joints as well as preserve a braced neutral spinal position, you have to create tension in your hips and shoulders and, by extension, your elbows, knees, wrists, and ankles. You do so by generating torque, which is expressed through external rotation, so rotating your limb away from your body, and internal rotation, rotating your limb towards the center of your body. So consider a power lifter setting up underneath a bar loaded with 800 pounds to perform a back squat. To move such a staggering amount of weight and avoid collapsing under the load, he has to brace his spine and generate torque by externally rotating his hips and shoulders. To create tension in his upper back and set his shoulders in a stable, tight position, he grips the bar just outside his shoulder's width and twists his hands into the bar as if he was trying to break it in half. To stabilize the structures of his lower body, he creates an external rotational force from his hips by screwing both feet into the ground, keeping his feet straight and parallel to each other, as if he were trying to spread a crack in the floor. Bracing his spine and generating torque in this manner is the only way the powerlifter can complete the lift without injury. If his knees collapse inward, would mean internal rotation of the hip, or his back bent, meaning his back flexed, with 800 pounds perched on his shoulders, not completing the lift would be the least of his worries. In short, torque enables the powerlifter to stabilize his position and minimize variability in movement, meaning that he can keep his back flat and maintain tension in his hips and shoulders, preventing potentially disastrous movement fault. If he does not generate torque, his body will find stability for him by defaulting into a bad position. I call this position hunting. When you fail to generate torque, you create an open circuit that your body closes down immediately by committing a local extension spinal fault, flaring out the elbows, collapsing your ankles, and your knees inward. So, what is torque, you might ask? Torque is turning force. It's the amount of energy that you need to turn a wrench or open a jar. When it comes to the human body, I use the word torque to describe the turning force generated by the hips and shoulders, which causes the limbs to rotate. Another way to think of torque is as a rotational force being applied to an object. For example, when you internally or externally rotate your hip or your shoulder while keeping your hand or foot anchored to a surface, such as the floor, or an object such as the barbell, you're generating torque. This rotational force turns on the musculature that stabilizes your joints in a good position. To help you understand how torque works and familiarize you with some common strength and conditioning cues for generating torque, let's look at 4 basic examples. Okay, so the 4 examples that we have going, so there's diagrams in here that I can see, but of course you can't. But the first one is just standing, okay? Something that if you start to pay attention to how people stand or how people move, you will be able to notice these. So the first one is somebody is just standing up and their knees are kind of close together. The shoulders are rotated internally. So their shoulders are rounded forward. This is how most people stand. Okay. And then you know how some people just naturally look athletic, right? There's no really other way to describe it. And things generally come naturally for them. So if you look at how they're set, I bet you that naturally, even as they're moving around, they have more torque in their hips and in their shoulders, just in general in their daily life. So their hips are a little bit more externally rotated. So the knees are pulled a little further apart and the arches are not collapsed. The shoulders are down and back. Their knees are pointed outward, not pointed in. And then it makes it easy for them to do really anything. And then here, there's another diagram of somebody going down into a squat, and there's a picture of somebody with no torque and somebody with torque. And the difference is that the person with no torque has knees pointed straight ahead and arches that are collapsed, and the person with torque has externally rotated hips. Their knees are pointed slightly out and their arches are lifted off the ground. This is how this person is squatting without pain in the spine, the hips, the knees, and the ankles. They're using their muscles to provide torque. And then the next diagram is looking at somebody doing a push-up. So the no torque diagram shows somebody with internally rotated shoulders. The palms of the hands are flat on the ground. The middle of the back is lifted higher than the back of the shoulder. So their mid back is rounded. And then you look at the person with torque and those shoulders are externally rotated. The mid back is flat. So there's no hump in the middle of the back. And the palm is lifted away from the ground. And this is what torque looks like in a push-up position. And there's no pressure on the wrist, the elbow, or the shoulder. And then the final one that we're looking at is somebody holding like a bar out in front of them. So picture a stick and he's holding the stick out in front of them. The person holding the stick with no torque has internally rotated shoulders. The elbows are flared out and the hand looks flat. And this is putting pressure on the shoulder joint, the elbow joint, and the wrist. And then the person with torque has externally rotated the shoulders. The elbows are not flared out. They're right in line with the shoulders and the hands. And the hand is not flat. It has a curve to it. And it looks like the person is trying to bend the stick in half. So again, that person is putting no pressure on the joints in his upper body. Okay, so In this quote, he's going to talk about how we're actually going to generate that torque. So, if you've experienced with the bracing sequence, you already know what it feels like to generate torque. When you externally rotate from your hips while keeping your feet straight and rooted to the floor, you can feel the tension in your lower body. Your glutes fire, your hips lock into place, and your feet come into an arch. This is how you generate torque from the hips while standing. It is also the most stable position for your ankles, knees, and hips. As a reminder, screw your feet into the ground means that you exert an outward force with your feet while keeping them in the same position. You're not turning them out, you're just exerting force in an outward direction. And then for the shoulders, just as screwing your feet into the ground stabilizes your hips, screwing your hands into the ground stabilizes your shoulders. For example, if you're setting up for a push up, you screw your left hand into the ground in a counterclockwise position, and you screw your right hand into the ground in a clockwise position. Again, you're not turning them outward, you're just exerting an outward rotational force. This is how you create torque to stabilize your wrists, elbows, and shoulders in a good position when you're pressing against a solid surface like the floor. As I mentioned earlier on, your hips and shoulders are ball and socket joints that are very similar in function. This is why the cues for creating stable shoulders are essentially the same as those for creating stable hips. Screwing your feet into the ground stabilizes your hips, while screwing your hands into the ground stabilizes your shoulders. Exactly why do you need to generate a rotational force to create stability in the primary engines of your hips and shoulders? Simple. There is slack within these ball and socket joints that allows for movement of your limbs. To make the joint stable and maintain a braced neutral spine, you need to wind up, twist, and spiral your limb into your hip or shoulder socket. In other words, when you create torque, you activate the musculature to support the joint. When you fail to create torque, you essentially hang on your tissues and rely on your tendons and ligaments to support this position. That's how injuries happen, FYI. The point is that the right kind of rotation will set your knee in a more stable position, dramatically reducing your potential for injury. But the wrong kind of rotation will put your knee in a disastrous position, increasing the odds of injury sooner or later. The key takeaway is this: your body will not leave you unstable. It recognizes instability as a liability and would rather close down that open circuit in the wrong way than leave you all loosey goosey. This is why generating torque is so important. You take up the capsular slack within the ball and socket joint and create tension in the muscular systems, which helps stabilize the joint in a strong position. So basically, you don't want to ask for more rotation than you need, which is something that's hard to do when you're still learning it. So, what I would rather somebody do if I'm trying to teach them external rotation of the shoulders and the hips is I'd rather do external rotational movements that are isolated. So instead of doing squats and focusing on keeping the outward rotation during the squat, I'm going to do a movement that asks for isolated external rotation. That way, we're not placing too much load. And that way, the client can figure out how to strengthen that external rotation without putting pressure on other places. So, I might do a clamshell. I might do a fire hydrant. I might do a hip circle, something like that. And then for the shoulders, I might do an active goalpost. I might do arm circles. I might do an around the world exercise, like focused on strengthening those external rotator muscles with isolated movements instead of big movements. And then once they've progressed enough that they understand how to externally rotate their shoulders and their hips with the correct muscle, then I'll start adding back in those functional movements like the squats, the deadlifts, the push-ups, that sort of stuff. Okay, so if you liked this episode and you want to try practicing it in the gym, just look up on Google hip and shoulder external rotational exercises and learn the musculature. Like, look at those muscles, see where they are and what they're supposed to do, and add that into your training regimen and see if you can move through your daily life and through your riding with less pain. All right, thanks for coming.
Thank you for listening to Elevate Your Ride. Find us on Instagram and Facebook, all linked in the podcast notes. We'll see you next time. The information provided by Elevate Your Ride is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as medical or professional advice. While we discuss health and fitness topics related to equestrians, the content provided through this podcast is not a substitute for professional advice. The views expressed by the host and guests on Elevate Your Ride are their own and should not be taken as professional guidance. We strive to provide accurate and up to date information, but we cannot guarantee that the information will be applicable to every individual listener or that it reflects the most current research or guidelines. Before making any changes to your health and fitness routine, we strongly recommend consulting with a qualified professional who can provide personalized advice based on your individual needs and circumstances. Elevate Your Ride and its creators will not be liable for any direct, indirect, consequential, special, exemplary, or other damages arising from the use of information on this podcast. Thank you for listening to Elevate Your Ride. We are committed to providing high quality content and appreciate your trust in us as a source of information for your health and fitness journey.